All right, we are live. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dan Kretka. You want to
And I'm
introduce
Kristen
yourself?
Duncan. Hi, y'all. I am Kristen Duncan. I'm an assistant professor at Clemson University.
So we're really happy to be here today. And so whether you're watching live or you end up watching this on replay, where we hope this will be kind of a fun experience. Let me just, as we're starting and giving people a few moments to join in, who maybe are just now joining us or just now clicking on the links. In fact, as we're talking, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to retweet my links right there so people know we're going live right now. Um, I just want to let you know a little bit about the idea of why we're doing this. There we go. I send a tweet. We're live now, so hopefully that brings some more people in. And so I've been doing the Visions of Education podcast since 2016 with Michael Milton, who's a high school teacher in Massachusetts, and that has been my best PD, right? Like it's the way that I learn from people. You know, I get to sit and talk to people. I love producing the podcast in the past, and then Zach Seitz does our editing now. But I love thinking through how we kind of learn from each other, and that's been really great. And 2020 hit. Dr. Duncan, I don't know how it hit for you, but it hit for me, and I got into a lull. My classes overwhelmed me, and in 2021 I've got a better schedule. So I've kind of said, you know what, I'm going to try some new stuff. And so live streaming is this kind of attempt to have these conversations with people doing cool work. And so I've got a few ones going on. If you are on the channel now and you want to subscribe, you'll get updates when we have new ones. But this is going to kind of be part of a series of education talks with people doing really cool scholarship. And then I've got once a month, I'm going to talk to Glenn Wiebe about social studies technology, stuff you can do in your classroom. And then we're going to do the SS chat recap on Mondays after. So if you're just joining, that's kind of the idea of this. And I'm hoping it'll be fruitful. But, you know, doing these already, and I've already done one of these with Kristen, we did a panel together, have been already like kind of what I hoped is really I'm getting to learn with people and enjoy. So let's start off just by talking. Dr. Duncan, how are things going for you? Is your semester underway? Is 2021 treating you any better than 2020? How are you doing?
So we've been back in class almost a full month at this point. Um, 2021 is giving me a little more room to breathe than 2020 did. Like you, Dan, I was really overwhelmed. I never imagined being that overwhelmed when I never left home, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, so much was happening. It was hard to. I would argue the first maybe 2 months of COVID, I couldn't do any research because I was glued to the television trying to find out the
Mm-hmm.
latest information about COVID. Um, so it was a little relaxing to get back to work. Um, but yeah, 2020 was a whole lot. 2021 is doing better for sure.
Good. Good. Well, I'm glad it's a little better. I actually got an email from, I don't know if you know Kevin Maywison, who's one of the members at our Kufa community who goes to our meetings. He sent me an email this morning. I'll share real quick. It was the beginning of his email. He was asking me questions about something, but he said, paradoxically, it feels like every week is a year. See our politics. And yet
Indeed.
every day is Groundhog Day. See coffee, email, Zoom, repeat. And so I thought he kind of summarized things up pretty well. But I have a little more space. And you know, one of the things I've thought about is really to do, you know, I think teaching online actually offers some opportunities, but you have to have space. Because if you don't have space, you're just trying to get stuff up. And that's how I felt in 2020. I wasn't at my best and I couldn't really do creative stuff because I was just trying to get stuff up. And I don't know if other people felt like that, but 2021, I'm like, no, I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to try new stuff. Um, so yeah, excited. We have Nicole Duncan has joined us and just said hi, Dr. Duncan.
Hey, Nicole.
So there you go. So if you are in the comments, if you're on this, please leave comments and questions along the way, and we will bring your comments into the chat and you know, talk about it a little bit. So let me ask you a question before we jump in and talk about your article, which is your new research is the reason we're here, because it's really tremendous work. How are you? This is the beginning of Black History Month, right? And there's always talk in the social studies communities about what this means. I think for some people is the one time of the year they look at history from a Black perspective, and sometimes they don't even, right? It's still from like a white gaze at Black history. How do you approach Black History Month? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, the conversations about
Black History Month
have always been pretty interesting to me. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo out of nowhere. Maybe
Do you
if
need
I
a
get
second?
rid of it.
And if you switch audio, bear with us for a second, everyone. If you switch audio sources, it may ask you then to go down to the cam mic and to change what your audio source is.
Okay.
So as Dr. Duncan is fixing that, I'll talk a little bit about Black History Month and I think when you think about the roots of Black History Month, you of course have to go to Carter G. Woodson, who is the one who came up with Black History Week as an emphasis, as a way in the, I think 1920s, 1930s. I'd have to look at the year, as a way to really think about center Black history and have people focus on it. Of course, he was already doing that, and a lot of Black educators were already centering Black history in oftentimes segregated schools. But then later, I think it was under Gerald Ford, that they went from Black History Week and they really bumped it up to Black History Month. And so since then, that's been a focus. But the problem is if that's the only time you're doing it, it can become really like this additive curriculum, I think is James Banks' old term, right? We're just adding in Black people. We're not changing the narrative. We're not really learning history through Black people. So that was, if you missed for a second, Dr. Duncan, I tried to give a brief history of Black History Week and month. Oh, and we don't have your audio. I think you probably have to go into your cam mic and check your audio too. So these things happen. Bear with us for just a moment. There we go. Gotcha.
Oh, wait.
Yep.
I hear an echo, but if y'all don't hear an echo, I'm fine.
It sounds good on my end.
Okay. So, growing up in an all Black space, I learned Black history year round, but Black History Month was like this extra time to really go big and celebrate. So like growing up in that environment and then moving to environments where people thought that February was the only time to study Black history or to learn any kind of Black history was interesting. And then, like you said, it was additive. And lots of firsts. So for me, Black history is a time to dig deeper, right? To learn about folks that you might not have learned about otherwise, to learn about events that you might not have learned about otherwise. So when I was teaching, I would try to incorporate Black history facts that my students wouldn't learn within the curriculum of whatever course I was teaching, right? So I remember vividly when I was teaching 8th grade Georgia Studies, during Black History Month, I taught them about the Haitian Revolution because they weren't going to get that in the Georgia Studies curriculum, right? That's a time to really celebrate, to really bring in new perspectives, to really go big. So yeah, we do that year round, but we really focus, we really hone in February.
Haitian Revolution. Anybody that's been around me lately knows that I read the David Blight's new big Frederick Douglass biography. I seriously read it. I finished it about 2 months ago and think about it like every single day.
Oh, wow.
It was like, it is a very deep book. There's so many parts, but it really talks a lot about the Haitian Revolution in that book, right? And Fred Douglass ended up later being, I think his title was ambassador to Haiti, and ended up like helping put on the Haitian exhibit at the World's Fair and having this role. But yeah, it's something that you're not taught about, and you're taught instead that the United States is the beacon of democracy, and you're taught the kind of traditional white narrative, where with the Constitution being kind of at the center of it, right? And sometimes the Declaration of Independence is there. Oftentimes, you don't get the hypocrisy of that document, right? that we're always living up to. And so, and the great thing that book made me do is rethink about who is the beacon of democracy in the Western Hemisphere, right? Is there any reason to think it's the United States? Why isn't it Haiti, right? Why did we not center revolts against slavery as the most patriotic things you could do if you believe in and I think it's worth defining a multicultural democracy, right? And that's something that we've only had in some kind of legitimate way since the 60s. And we're still fighting that, right, with voter suppression laws and everything. So when you look at it from that Black perspective, it's totally different. And I've mentioned, oh my gosh, Douglas is just what he calls everything changes your whole notion of history, right? He called the Civil War the Slaveholders' Rebellion. That was his name for it, right? Which shows you like who really is fighting here. And he pointed out those large, powerful slave owners were the ones driving the entire Civil War and the reason for it. And it really takes apart some of these other myths around it. He called the 1877, what was it, the compromise that ended Reconstruction. He called it peace among the whites, is what he called it. And I was like, whoa, like that changes the whole way you think about it.
Accurate. Right? So.
And it's just really critical. But to me, I think you centering that perspective helps you really understand better the type of democracy we need. I don't know. That's the way I would think. I think you learn better from groups who've been historically oppressed what democracy and freedom are than you do from people in positions of privilege. Sorry, you got me going. I just got. So let's talk about your study. I know a lot of people, anyone joining in is probably really wanting to hear it. So you published a new article that is titled, "What Better Tool Do I Have? A Critical Race Approach to Teaching Civics." And you published this in, I think, the newest version of the high school journal. So you can check it out. And it is open access article. Is that correct? That you're able to download the article? Or do they have to?
I don't think so. But if you're interested, you can find it on my academia page.
You can send those emails and DMs if you ever need articles, right? I think most people are willing to share them that way. So tell us about this study. I mean, I taught government for 4 years, and it was not a critical race approach to teaching civics, and I'm very much regretting and already thinking that you're teaching it in more powerful ways. Tell us about what this study looked like.
Okay, so first, this was derived from a larger study. So I was seeking to study how Black teachers used what I called emancipatory pedagogies to help Black students navigate systems of white supremacy, right? I had in this study, there were 2 social studies teachers and 2 math teachers. But one of the social studies teachers, what she was doing in her classroom was so intriguing, so interesting that I felt it was worthy of its own article. So when I say emancipatory pedagogies, it's based in the work of Carter G. Woodson, who you just named as the father of Black History Week, W.B. Du Bois, Arnold Ellis, and Anna Julia Cooper. So when I say emancipatory pedagogies, I'm looking at teachers that have high expectations of their students, that make their students knowledgeable of the positive contributions of their race, and who help their students to develop a critical lens so that they can begin to understand their oppression and address it, right? So I'm studying teachers who are doing these things. So I come across this particular teacher who is doing these really interesting things. And I should add that this study took place the year Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. So in this particular school district, he was killed 2 days before school started, which put his death and what was happening in Ferguson, the subsequent protests, really at the forefront of students' minds and hearts, right? Students are coming to school talking about what's happening in Ferguson. And this particular teacher was like, you know what? Students are talking about this. I can't stick. This is not a time for me to stick to the pacing guide. I need to address their needs. So she really kind of restructured her course. Now, this was the kind of teacher, she was already doing these things, but she refocused them to fit what students were really focused on in that moment. So she had her students discussing current events regularly. She rejected this notion of color blindness. So lots of people teach civics and US government as if the law applies to everyone equally all the time. And this teacher, having lived at this point 37 years as a Black woman in the United States, knew that that was not the case. So she used that as the foundation of her course, right? The title of the paper is What Better Tool Do I Have? Because she said that, what better tool do I have to teach you about how race will affect you in the law due to skin color, due to race. Um, so yeah, she rejected color blindness because she knew that the law isn't actually colorblind. She um, she had her students discuss current events regularly, racialized current events in her classroom, and she really valued their stories. And we can talk about that a little later. But she talked about how her students, and she was teaching ninth graders, they all had some kind of story, some kind, in critical race theory, we call them counter stories, but they all had some kind of story that involved race and structures of government. And so she really centered those in her class, which I thought was really cool.
Tell us a little bit more about critical race theory. Of course, this has been in the news, right? The former president, who's no longer president and lost the last election, um, that was one of the things there was conservative backlash against the 1619 Project, which sought to center slavery as part and Black voices as part of understanding American history. And then there was in critical race theory. Those were the two things I remember seeing kind of a backlash against in curriculum. Can you tell us a little bit about what critical race theory is and what it means for education?
Sure. So, critical race theory is a theoretical framework that comes from legal theory, right? So, Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, and several other scholars, they started off in critical legal studies, but they felt like that field wasn't, it was really critical, but it wasn't critical regarding issues of race. They felt like there wasn't enough focus on race. So they created essentially critical race theory. Um, it started off in the legal field. Gloria Ladson Billings is primarily responsible for the role it plays in education at the moment. But critical race theory really it operates from the assumption that race is so deeply embedded in the American social fabric that it appears normal, right? So you think that, if you see that people of certain races um, are supposed to be in certain places because that's their place in society, that's likely because of racism, right? Like, people didn't choose necessarily to end up in those places. Racism confined people to those spaces. Um, critical race theory has a series of tenets, some of which I use in this study. So there's a critique of liberalism. There is uh, the idea that race. Oh, I'm sorry.
A little bit about what that critique is of liberalism, what that means.
So thank you for that question. So there's this idea that people of color in particular should have like a long, slow march to freedom, right? Like incrementally give people their rights. And then someday, I don't know when that day is, we will all be recognized as equal citizens. Critical race theory realized that the someday never happens. So the slow incremental pace doesn't work because you never get to the end goal. Um, so that's the critique of liberalism because it just doesn't work. Um, Critical race theorists really place a really strong value on what we call counter stories. And so these are the stories, the lived experiences that people of color tell, right? Um, and counter stories have value for both the speaker and the listener. So if people of color are talking about their experiences with racism, it benefits the speaker to have some place to tell that story, right? Um, but it benefits the listener if the listener is a person of color, then they might Richard Delgado calls it says it aids in psychic self-preservation. So it helps people understand that what they went through wasn't necessarily their fault, right? Like if you experience something similar, you might have internalized it as your fault when in reality that's a result of racism. But also the counter stories of people of color help white people see something that they wouldn't have seen otherwise, right? Like if you go about the world only seeing through your own gaze, you wouldn't have the opportunity to know what people of color are experiencing. So those are just a few of the tenets of critical race theory. Those are actually the tenets that I used in this study. So that's, I guess, why they were fresh on my mind.
Like there's like layers of you kind of enacting the tenets out here, right? So the teacher seems to be telling, for example, counter stories in their classroom and holding space for it. And then, for the students to do it, by doing that, it's almost as if they're enacting those same things themselves. And then your research is in that essence a counter story of what civics can be. So I just see like the layers going from the students telling counter stories to the teacher to you. And so are the demographics of the teacher Black and the students are primarily Black in the classroom that you were studying?
So in this school, they call it CP, like college prep. It's basically the not advanced course or the not AP course. It might have been called general ed in some places. And while the school is really diverse, most of the students in her classroom are Black. I would say 90% of her students are Black and probably 8% are Latinx. So almost everyone in the room is a person of color who will likely have particular life experiences, right? So she used her classroom. At my church, we have this song that we sing every week. And it says, there's a line that says, "This house shall be called a place of restoration." And she kind of used her classroom for that, right? This is a place, because the world is hard, right? As kids get older, they see that for themselves, particularly as students of color. But this is a place where you can come and sit down and relax a little bit, and we're gonna figure out what to do when you go back outside of these doors. So yeah.
So what's the curriculum and pedagogy look like for this teacher? Can you tell us a little bit more? I guess tell us a story, right? A counter story that kind of explains what's happening in this class. I taught government for 4 years, and I felt, like looking back now, I can feel like the whiteness of my government classroom, right? Certainly my first year, I didn't know the curriculum. So I was I used the textbook, and then I departed, really even starting in my second year, and started trying to do different things. But I certainly don't know if I knew how to appropriately, or directly, I guess would be a better term, address issues of race across these categories, right? Because so many of the concepts in government, from founding documents to everything, if you don't understand through a racial perspective, there's, as you said, right, you're not understanding that the laws didn't apply equally, or how they were, there was get arounds around the laws and things like that. What did the class look like? What did the curriculum look like? You told me a little about the pedagogy, right? The counter stories, that's being a place of restoration. But what was the curriculum? How was it different?
So, before I get to the curriculum, I do want to say there's a specific reason why I study Black teachers and the ways Black teachers address issues of race. And this is because I think we as a field have a lot to learn from Black teachers. I don't expect anyone to mimic what she did in her classroom, because she had decades of experience living in a Black body to come to these conclusions, right? But there is a whole lot we can learn. So as far as her curriculum goes, she considered herself fortunate in that she was not teaching a course that had a high stakes exam attached to it, which allowed her some freedom, right? She wasn't going to be surveilled like the US history teacher would be. So the course, according to the school district, was set up, basically there are units set up according to branch of government. So there are units about the legislative branch, and units about the executive branch, and units about the judicial branch. But because Ferguson was so fresh on all her students' minds, she took a different approach and taught Ferguson, and then helped her students see how the branches of government and the agencies in the branches connected, or worked together or didn't work together, and what was happening there, right? So that's one of the things she was doing. She made their counter stories part of the curriculum, right? So they would come in and they would talk about what had happened to them, or what they saw, even what they saw on the news. US government courses really kind of have a lot of latitude if you can take the right perspective to it. And she, instead of teaching the strict, this branch, this branch, this branch, she was like, well, life doesn't work that way. So let's take life and figure out how US government applies to what is happening in the world that we live in. Yeah.
I love that. And I always say it's really hard the first year, because you're learning so many new, concepts. I remember my first year, I had to teach about bureaucracy, and it seems like the most boring thing ever, right? So bureaucracy, or bureaucrats generally work in the executive branch, right? And they run the different departments. They're the ones that actually get stuff done. And that seems like a boring, unimportant concept, until you talk about something like Ferguson, and you start to think about what's the Justice Department's role in ensuring, racial justice in this country. What laws exist, and how do they enforce those, right? What reports are coming out? And there's the report that came out that showed the systematic racism in Ferguson from police, that was ticketing Black people at high rates and leading to them spending time in jail for just ridiculous minor offenses, and even jaywalking and things like that. And so you start to see bureaucrats are the ones who came out with that report, who expose injustice. And so once you know government a little bit, the concepts, you can see it. But I'm guessing it really helps that you have a veteran teacher here.
So not only was she a veteran teacher, but she had worked in the courts before she became a teacher, right? So she had experience in government, seeing firsthand what happens to lots of Black kids in these systems. So she could really speak from experience, having seen a lot of this stuff.
And I love that, right? That issue centered approach, right? So if Ferguson is at the center of your students' minds, being able to, as a teacher, say, let's explore government through that. And I think sometimes I was talking about this on the SS Chat recap on Monday. We have a little podcast we did after the social studies Twitter chat. And that was we were talking, somebody asked the question about, the difference for teaching students like historical thinking skills and teaching students to be citizens. And I think sometimes we can get lost in these subject matters. You know what I mean? The disciplines, like, oh, I'm a history teacher, right? Well, but you're not trying to produce historians. You're trying to produce citizens. And so what do citizens need history knowledge for, right? And they need some of the historical thinking skills, but like that doesn't need to be the center of things, right? They need to understand how history can also interpret the world, how to understand, how we got to the point we're at to make change. And so her experience, by the way, is having, experience in courts is, I can only imagine, was profound for her class and changing her curriculum from the textbook she was handed. So what did and you got to observe her class. What did it feel like to be in this teacher's classroom who really had this critical race approach to teaching?
She really, I don't know if you can. I would say, okay, so first of all, I would say she's a warm demander, right? So like this classroom felt like I walked in and I was like, oh, this is a place where I belong. So she had like all these pennants for different universities in the back of the classroom, and she had symbols that represent like African and African American symbols on her bookcase. Her walls were decorated with like newspapers with civil rights activists that had been arrested. It felt like a space where, like, even before she said a word, it's a space where you feel, particularly as a young Black person, it's a place where you feel affirmed, right? Um, but yeah, it was very clear that she didn't just she cared about her students, and not in a way that like I'm just going to be nice to them, but I understand that them understanding the content of this course has repercussions for them outside of this classroom and outside of this building. So we're gonna work and figure out how to make this apply to my students' lives so that they can be better prepared to navigate, the systemic and structural and institutional racism that they're gonna have to deal with. So yeah, I mean, students were really interested in government in ways that I have never seen because they saw how it applied to their lives.
So we do have a comment I can bring in here from Dr. Subzalian, who has done incredible work in our field. And in fact, right before we started this call, I was telling Kristen that I really thought how Leilani's work on thinking of civics through an indigenous orientation really was powerful for me to rethink the ways that it was easy, or I might center whiteness if I'm not explicitly addressing it. And I feel like what you're doing is a very similar thing by using critical race theory to approach how this teacher addressed it. And so Leilani makes a really good point that it's not a call for white educators to be like Black educators because they don't have those experience, but there's so much they can learn from Black educators. So I thought that's a really good point. Anything you want to add to that?
Thanks, Leilani. Yeah, I actually, the paper you're talking about, Leilani's paper, is cited in this paper because I do feel like it's another perspective, a marginalized perspective of civics And I wanted this paper to be in conversation with hers. So, yay.
By the way, I will mention briefly, quick plug, that our Visions of Education podcast has had both of you on to talk about some of your work. You did come on and talk in episode 150 about Black teachers interrupting their white colleagues' racism, which was part of this study, right? But a separate paper, a different piece of your time in that school. And Dr. Sabzalian, I think hers is episode 128. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but is a really profound episode that talks about, so often we talk about government and we just talk about state in the U.S. governments, and we often ignore tribal governments and perspectives. And so her paper, I can't recommend enough. It was published in Theory and Research in Social Education. Leilani responded with, "I love that our theories of civic education are in conversation." I did think that was a wonderful way to put it. So Dr. Duncan, what are the implications of this study for educators? I mean, what would you want educators, administrators, and scholars to know and think about, like where we're going out of this study? What can we learn from it?
I think that there are quite a few things that we can take away from this study. So, first and foremost, for social studies teachers, I think it's pretty easy for people to see how race fits in history classrooms, perhaps in geography, but race is present in everything, right? Like, we need to be talking about race in civics. We need to be talking about race in economics for sure. We need to be talking about race in behavioral sciences. We need to be talking about, there is no race neutral subject in the social studies. Well, there's no race neutral subject, period, but particularly in the social studies, we need to be incorporating conversation or having conversations with our students about race, because pretending that subjects are colorblind really serves no one. That's the first thing. The rest are really for teacher educators. We also have to model this for our students. We can help them see how educational policies have. So sometimes, let's take No Child Left Behind, for example, right? No Child Left Behind was put in place under the auspices of closing the achievement gap. And all that ended up happening was students who are well off still got to engage in critical thinking and do all the things they were doing before, whereas poor, primarily students of color, ended up doing lots of test prep. So it actually widened the gap of what students have the opportunities to do in school. And so teacher educators, we have to help pre-service and in-service teachers find ways to talk about race in their classrooms, because it's not obvious to everybody, right? Like, I literally think and talk about race all day. So so we have to help our teachers get there. So and then finally, there just needs to be more research, right? So we need to see what teachers are doing, how teachers are talking about race. And our field has done a much better job in recent years, right? Of researching how teachers talk about race. But we have got to get a little deeper. Yeah.
I mean, those are really profound implications. And here's another comment by Dr. Sabzalian. Yes, there's no race neutral subject in the social studies. She's quoting us. These can turn into now tweets we can advertise. Hey, go check out the episode. So thank you. I think that's such an important one. And I know for me as as a white male educator, it's been important for me really to make sure that a lot of the research and scholarship and podcasts I listen to are listening to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because otherwise some of these things I just are a little off my radar. I don't think of them because they're not centered in my experience. And I was just thinking about how you brought up what issue, I'm trying to remember now, what issue you just brought up about No Child Left Behind, how it's very much racialized. And I hadn't thought about it. And somebody recently, I was reading something, and they talked about how school shooting policies have been racialized. While school shootings primarily happen are by white male students in suburban schools, they ended up having real policy impacts on schools with Black and brown children who faced the same types of different changes in policy, but that really were used harshly against them, as opposed to these suburban schools and often white schools where they were the policies were quote unquote meant to protect them. So there was like this negative impact for something that was really not affecting those schools. It was affecting different schools. And so until somebody brought it up through the lens of race, I didn't think about how school shootings had this differential impact and harm oftentimes on students of color. So, but I really appreciate and love this paper. And Dr. Subzalian says so too. It's such an excellent paper. To me, this study makes clear the case for why teacher education programs and school districts must do a better job to recruit, prepare, and retain Black educators. And that's a long history too, right? Post Brown versus Board, we lost a generation of Black educators in this country and administrators.
Absolutely. And I will say, this particular teacher is really, she had a really unique teacher education situation where she was allowed to choose her mentor teacher. And she selected a teacher that she had in high school who had actually started her teaching career in a segregated school. So this teacher was obviously at the tail end of her career at that point. But because she had taught in that segregated school, she had a certain teaching philosophy. And there were certain aspects of her teaching that held over from that environment. And that is who Ebony, my participant, learned under. So I think that also has a lot to do with why she taught the way she taught. Wait.
Sorry, that was me. I forgot to unmute. Yeah, and we have those problems are throughout teacher education. If we don't place I know with some of our young Black teachers, if we don't place them in schools where they're supported and affirmed, just like students need to be, it can be a really traumatic, terrible experience. And I've seen it happen over and over. We have to be really intentional. Who are our supervisors in programs? Who are we pairing teachers with? Right? Who's ready to do this work? And so I think you really shine a light on what this means for a civics classroom, but of course for all of social studies and all of education. So, Dr. Duncan, before we go, is there anything else you want to plug or where people can find you online?
You can find me at my academia page, on my Twitter at Dr. Kristen Duncan. I think that's it. I'm around. I respond to people usually, unless I'm overwhelmed in 2020.
Very quick, I asked you if you could send me the full paper so I could read it, and you did within like a day. So not that you should expect a response within 24 hours, give her time.
I do take weekends off now. I haven't done that in a long time, but yeah.
So just for anyone that's joining us late, or just said, the paper is What Better Tool Do I Have? A Critical Race Approach to Teaching Civics. And it was just recently published in the High School Journal. And you can follow Dr. Kristen Duncan on Twitter, or you can find her research at her academia page. And we're hoping to do more of these. So hopefully we'll bring on some people. If you're watching this and you do research and you'd like to come on, I'm featuring people I can learn from. And Dr. Duncan was really gracious to be one of the first ones to do it. And I think next week I'm going to talk to Dr. Wayne Journell about misinformation, if you want to join back. That's, I think, the next one. That'll be next week. So Dr. Duncan, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.